Well, we want to welcome everybody this afternoon. My name's Frank Galuzza. I'm the Dean of Academic Affairs here at Patrick Henry College. We have a real treat today. I want to introduce Stuart Taylor, Jr. Mr. Taylor is an author, journalist, and a leading Supreme Court expert covering the court for the New York Times, Newsweek, and the National Journal. He graduated from both Princeton University and Harvard Law School. Mr. Taylor served as a senior writer for the American Lawyer Media between 1989 and 1997, lectured at Princeton University for a year, and was a reporter and Supreme Court correspondent for the New York Times and the Baltimore Sun. He also worked for the DC law firm of Wilmer Hale. He's authored a new book on the affirmative action issue in higher education that will be decided by the Supreme Court this spring. And he's a regular contributing columnist for the National Journal, contributing editor at Newsweek, a non-resident senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institute. He comments on legal affairs and focuses frequently on the Supreme Court, appearing in many publications as The Atlantic, Slate, The New Republic, and The Wall Street Journal. He co-authored a book entitled Until Proven Innocent, Political Correctness and the Shameful Injustice of the Duke Lacrosse Case, which explored the reliability of prosecutors, the trustworthiness of the media, and the role of extreme political ideology in the academy. The New York Times Sunday Book Review referred to the book as a riveting narrative. Mr. Taylor's journalism honors are many, including the 2009 Northern California Innocent Project Media Award for his work on Duke Lacrosse rape fraud, and 2002 National Headliner Award for Best Special Magazine Column. Mr. Taylor and his wife live in Washington. They have 2 daughters. So I introduce to you Mr. Stuart Taylor.
So we're going to talk today largely about affirmative action and the key Supreme Court case that is being discussed, I suspect, by the judges, perhaps justices, perhaps even as we speak, and will be decided sometime officially, publicly later this year. But let me ask a couple of questions first about careers.
Sure.
Because you start out, and again, Harvard Law School, and you're working at a corporate law firm, and then, in essence, you decide to become a journalist. What did corporate law lack that you wanted to move out?
Good question. One thing that I don't put in my biography because it's too long ago and too long, was that before I went to Harvard Law School, I was at the Baltimore Sun for 3.5 years as a reporter, starting with the police beat, which is where you start. The editor was a little chagrined when I arrived, not knowing how to type a word, but we got past that. And so my first interest was always journalism, and law was kind of my second interest. Having the opportunity to go to Harvard Law School seemed like something I shouldn't let pass. So I did that and went, and then having done that, my best options by far in terms of making a decent living were corporate law. So I did that, but I always thought, if I get another chance, I'd like to go back to journalism. And through a sort of a fortuity, I ended up getting an offer to go to the New York Times in 1980 as a legal specialist in the Washington Bureau. And that seemed so improbable that I thought it must be, meant to happen. So that's what I did.
So much more entertaining, the corporate law?
I'd say I think it's much more interesting than corporate law. I don't mean to diss corporate law. A lot of my best friends are corporate lawyers, and they like what they do. And some of them, I think, and they perform very honorable work. But I, at least certainly in my youth and to some extent still, think of corporate law as, just shuffling the deck chairs on the liner, that, you're not, you're kind of greasing the wheels of capitalistic enterprise, and there's somebody else on the other side of every transaction or every case who's kind of working at cross purposes with you. And that just didn't strike me as something I wanted to spend my life doing. Journalism, I've always had a little bit of the preacher in me, and so journalism, my interest, although not my job for a long time, was to write commentary about major public issues, and that's what I ended up doing. And that had been interesting to me since I was a teenager, reading people like James Reston and Eric Sevareid.
And so, thinking back at the many articles you've written over 3 decades, what's your favorite?
Favorite article? boy. I'd say my maybe the Duke lacrosse articles that found their way into being the book that was mentioned. But it reminds me, I interviewed Justice Brennan once and asked him what his favorite opinion was, and he said, "Oh, they're like my children. I love them all. Some better than others, perhaps, but you wouldn't admit it when it's your children."
Tell us a little bit about that whole Duke lacrosse case and the book you wrote at a time when still the public opinion was unanimously condemning them. Tell us about that book and then what happened.
Yeah, well, just for those who don't really know what the case is about, the Duke lacrosse team, really the entire team, was accused of raping and complicity in rape because they had a party during spring break at which they brought strippers, which was a very dumb thing to do, but they were one of 22 campus organizations that did that year. That was one of many things that escaped attention, including sororities with male strippers. So that was their mistake, and then they got a stripper who was kind of mentally disturbed and dishonest and a prostitute, and things went sour during the party, and she left angry. And hours later, after the police had been unsuccessful at getting her to talk, they were admitting her to a mental institution involuntarily, and the admitting lady said, "Something happened to you? Were you raped?" She nodded. Nobody believed her except one feminist nurse during the subsequent hours of interviews, but she ended up sticking with her allegation. An opportunistic district attorney named Mike Nifong, who had an election campaign in which he needed the black vote, these were black strippers, decided to make a case out of it and did so at high volume. And the Duke faculty, as it was pointed out earlier in a conversation I had, more or less formed itself into a mob, or all of the vocal parts of the faculty, in which they presumed the guilt of their own students. The media did more or less the same, and I was alerted to it by a friend who's had a son on the press team. He said, "If you dig into this, you'll find that it's a fraud." And I dug into it, and that's what I found. And because of the fact that the evidence, the publicly available evidence, for a while, you could see why people bit on this. The district attorney, Mike Nifong, who was white, was screaming at the top of his lungs, "These people are rapists, they're guilty, they're doing a cover-up." You know, the woman's claim was that 3 of them had raped her in a bathroom in horrible ways. And so, it was logical to think, well, he's the district attorney, why would he make this up? But as time passed, lots of reasons why he would make it up and why it wasn't true came to light. I wrote about them. They were available to others. And the mob just kept charging ahead as though nothing had happened.
Facts are optional?
Facts are optional. And it was fashionable on campus and in the media to say the privileged white guys are taking advantage of the poor black woman again. And so I decided it was that I should write a book about that phenomenon. I mean, the whole thing. But the thing that put it over the top for me as a book was not that one district attorney was committing egregious misconduct, which happens, unfortunately, now and then, here and there. It was that the entirety of the national and local media and all Duke professors who were bold enough to speak out about it were presuming guilt after innocence had been proven, not just before.
So what's happened to those students who were unjustly accused?
They are doing pretty well. They were all, suspended from Duke. One of them graduated the day before he was indicted. The other 2 who were younger, they were sophomores, were suspended, and then after they were cleared, they were invited back in. They said no thanks. They all went on, finished college, and are going on to have good lives. But that was far from guaranteed. The reasons that things broke their way had something to do with the state bar had some good people who realized that the DA was violating at least the publicity restrictions, They began a proceeding to disbar him. That forced him, just because of the pendency of the proceeding, to resign the case. The case was handed over to the State Attorney General Roy Cooper, who, to his great credit, had it reinvestigated from the ground up and announced at a press conference after doing that, not only that, hey, the evidence is insufficient, we're not going to press charges, which would have left a huge cloud hanging over these kids for the rest of their lives. He said, these young men are innocent. It didn't happen. And although that's the right thing to do, prosecutors almost never do that. Mm-hmm. And so these young men were fortunate in that their families had the means to hire them superb lawyers. That was another reason it went well for them. They were fortunate that the state bar did the right thing at the right time. They were fortunate the attorney general did the right thing for the right time. Eventually, Nifong, the prosecutor, was disbarred, but it could have turned out much worse. I doubt they could have ever been convicted, but they certainly could have gone to trial, had a hung jury, possibly been convicted, and had this cloud for the rest of their lives. And frankly, if they had been poor or just working class, and if they had been black and the complainant had been white, it could have gotten worse. Could have been worse.
Okay.
And to their credit, they recognize that, and they have personally made a lot of efforts to sensitize people to the broader dangers of prosecutorial misconduct, of people being falsely accused of crimes, and people who lack the opportunities these three kids had to put on a defense.
Yeah. Let's turn now to affirmative action, and this is the new book, which is really there have been other books on this subject. I think this is the definitive book at this point. And notice the subtitle here, title Mismatch, and then how affirmative action hurts students it's intended to help, and why universities won't admit it. And that reminds me a lot of the welfare debate in the mid-90s. What really led to action by Congress on welfare reform was not so much a question of how much it cost or something, but the realization that in many ways welfare was often hurting the very people it was intended to help. And so that's what you've been doing over here. You say you want to shift the debate from is it right to does it work? And why is it important to shift the debate in that way?
Yeah, and by the way, I think your analogy is a good one. I'm aware of your distinguished work on the welfare issue. But I have gone from being kind of when I was at the New York Times, and not writing opinion articles, I tended to absorb the opinions I was surrounded with, which were by and large pro-affirmative action. I prefer the term racial preference because that's what we're talking about, and affirmative action is a euphemism, and a misleading euphemism at that. When President Kennedy declared affirmative action as a federal government policy in 1962, I think it was, it meant trying really hard not to discriminate against people on grounds of race. Now it means the opposite. That's why I call it racial preference. But over time, especially as I became an opinion writer, I became more and more convinced this was doing a lot of harm, and was unfair, and was being defended dishonestly. And I do think it does particular amount of harm on the people who are on the losing end, to people like firefighters, police officers, white firefighters, police officers, who find themselves in a situation where they will never get promoted because of a racial quota, basically. With colleges, I think it operates in a way that is unfair often to whites, and especially Asians. Asians much more than whites, as a proportionate matter, are the people who are on the losing end of this. They're the people who are passed over to fill the quotas for blacks and Hispanics. But I think, then that's unfair, and Abby Fisher, who I've met, who's bringing the Texas case in the Supreme Court, she suffered a real harm. But her life isn't going to be blighted by it. She's going to have a perfectly good life. She'll have good opportunities. Instead of going to the University of Texas, she went to the University of Louisiana. The people who are really harmed, my co-author Rick Sander, and he asked me into this book, and I are convinced, are people who are perfectly good students, but who are jumped by racial preferences into colleges, universities, for which they just aren't qualified or well prepared. You know, it's like taking a kid who's got a B average at a mediocre high school and, let's say, 1,000 on the SATs, and putting them into a university where most people have A averages from better high schools and 1,400 SATs. The average gaps are huge because of the shortage of well-qualified black and Hispanic, but especially black, applicants to college. And the colleges want to fill their numbers, and the only way they can do it is by going way down in the barrel. What they won't admit is that this can do grave damage to the students who supposedly prefer. They arrive at college, they've been told, you know, you're great, you're going to do fine here, and don't believe all this stuff about how you aren't well qualified, you're perfectly well qualified. Then let's say the kid wants to do pre-med. It's especially strong if you have someone who has a science interest. Well, most of them, because they've been jumped into a category where their classmates are far better qualified, are going to fall rapidly behind. They're going to, they get bad grades, they flunk their first test, or they get a D, they get bad grades. They are suddenly hit with the fact that, you know, it's like taking me and putting me on a college football team and expecting that I'm going to be able to, to compete. They can't compete. They would do fine at a college where their classmates were on a par with them, but because of race, they've been singled out and put into colleges where they're and so the harms this does include the following. There's a huge attrition of black students who want to, and Hispanics who want to be scientists, engineers, doctors, professors, any challenging intellectual occupation, who would become those things if they were at colleges for which they were well qualified, who bail out and go to the sociology department or the African American Studies department because because they can't pass the courses they wanted to take. This has a huge toll on, I think, their intellectual self-confidence, their long-term career patterns. Blacks flunk the bar exam at more than twice the white rate, even when they're equally qualified entering law school, because of this phenomenon, because they're at the wrong law schools. Fewer than half of entering black law students ever pass the bar exam. They're left deep in debt. They're left with, with no career after pouring several years of their lives into this. We think, although the evidence is less strong for this, that a lot of people's careers are worse because of this phenomenon, that being at the bottom of your class at Harvard may still leave you with a lot of good options, but imagine being at the bottom of your class at, say, GW or Colgate, when you could have been above the middle of your class at, say, American University. I think most employers I've talked to, and there are some data that validate this, most employers I've talked to say, I'd rather have somebody who's done well at whatever they were doing than somebody who is bumping along the bottom. And so for all these reasons, I think this is doing grave harm to a lot of black kids, harm that is lifelong. And that's why we focus on that in this book. Also, although this is not a new theme, there's a lot of empirical evidence for it that's developed and that has not been publicized that's in our book. I don't mean to denigrate it, the traditional reasons for opposing affirmative action, but those arguments have been had for decades. Nobody's changing their mind about that anymore. And our main audience for this book were people who have a benign view of affirmative action, of racial preferences, but who are willing to open their eyes to evidence that undermines what they think.
So sometimes there's evidence that, students who are admitted to colleges and universities that otherwise they would not have been admitted to, but they're still graduating. I mean, there are some people who drop out, but they're still graduating. What specific statistics do we have about those who start out, let's say, in science and engineering and medicine and so forth, and then end up in something that's a lot easier to pass?
Well, for example, one leading study found that blacks who entered elite schools with aspirations to be science, technology, engineering, or math majors, STEM majors, were about half as likely as whites in the same position to finish college with STEM degrees. Okay. And there's evidence that at the University of California, after racial preferences were banned by popular initiative in 1996, although the number of blacks and Hispanics at Berkeley and UCLA, the elite campuses, went down dramatically, those students didn't drop out, didn't fall out of college. They ended up going to Cal Riverside or Cal Irvine, and the graduations rates went up, and the science persistence rates went up. And let me read you a little passage from an email that just came the other day from a man whose name I don't have, I'm not yet at liberty to give, but I think he speaks to something he said. I'm a white PhD candidate at Southern Illinois University. During my 4 years at SIU, I have been involved with several campus programs aimed at supporting and graduating our black male students. Our black male graduation rate is 25% within 6 years. Now, the apparent contradiction between what you said about graduation and this may be explained by the fact that the best graduation rates are at the most elite colleges. Mm-hmm. Harvard and Princeton, the affirmative action admits there, tend to graduate. And by the way, they tend to be closer in their qualifications to their classmates than at a place like Southern Illinois. And so as you go down the prestige hierarchy, these racial preferences are prevalent at least the top 200 universities in the country. This is not like not just an Ivy League thing. And the farther down you go in the hierarchy, the more damage you see being done to the students, because the pool of people who are qualified for the universities they're in gets smaller and smaller as you go down.
And what effect does this have on K through 12 education?
I think kind of I tend to think of it the other way around, which is that the reason we have racial preferences is K through 12 education ends up with the average black student, and this is validated by the National Association of Assessment of Educational Progress. The average black 12th grader is at the same level in terms of learning as the average white 8th grader. That's why there's such a tiny pool of blacks and somewhat larger pool, but still small, Hispanics who are well qualified to go to the colleges that are eager to have them. I think there is a backwards effect, though. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a powerful disincentive effect. The knowledge, it's best expressed by John McWhorter, who's a black critic of affirmative action. He wrote in his book, Losing the Race, I was something like this. I was available from at least the age of 10, that there was something called affirmative action, and that what it meant was that I would not have to work as hard or do as well as my white classmates would in order to get into a good college. And that had an effect on me. And I think that has an effect on a lot of kids.
So it has an effect on the kids. Does it also have an effect on, in a sense, the teachers, the administrators, by taking off some of the pressure that would otherwise be on them to improve what is often an abysmal educational product?
Yes, and I think at a larger level, the impact is more political. You know, I think people who are in the college, who are teaching at K-12 schools are by and large doing the best they can. I think a lot of them aren't very good at it, and if they weren't protected by unions, they would be advised to go somewhere else. But I don't think they're dogging it just because, well, they're black students, you know, can jump into college anyway. But I do think, there's a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that blacks just shouldn't be expected to be good academically. The same fellow whose email I was reading earlier said that as a teaching assistant at his college, he had been reproached for docking black as well as white students who don't show up for class on time. You know, he'd been told basically, hey, don't you know they're on colored people's time? It's not fair to hold them to the same standards. That attitude is pervasive throughout all levels of American education. And I think that does grave harm, because I think black students who are capable of achievement are being channeled and told by the system that they don't really need to achieve, that they'll be kind of helped along.
let me throw a counter-argument as far as being helped along, that you actually could be a running back on a football team if you had such an incredibly wonderful group of linemen in front of you that they knocked every defensive player out of the way and you had an unobstructed run into the end zone. The argument is sometimes made that if there were better support services, in a sense, for students who are thrown into a difficult academic environment, but if there were better support services for them, in essence, if they had a better line blocking for them, then they would be able to succeed.
I think there's something to that argument. I think that one of the problems with this system is that the colleges tend to, once you get there, you're kind of told sink or swim. Mm-hmm. If you're struggling, the colleges, most of them, don't do very much to help you. And what they do is they've kind of done away with flunking people out. Grade inflation and other phenomena, because otherwise they'd be taking a whole bunch of black kids at the beginning of the freshman year, and by the end of the freshman year, they'd be gone. Well, that doesn't work, so they just don't flunk very many of them out anymore, depending on the university, although this rate that this guy talked about. So I think that's a problem, and I think there are students who could do well at the colleges for which they're not initially well qualified with the right combination of remedial services and hard work. The reason why our book doesn't emphasize that so much as it does the problem at the admissions level is, A, the colleges are not, it takes a lot of money to do that right. They don't have a lot of money right now. So the prospect of improvement at that front isn't very likely. And number two, would it really make sense to have every selective college in the country and law school and other university have almost a separate remedial program populated almost entirely by black and Hispanic students, as opposed to them going to colleges where they don't need a remedial program, or to community colleges and then transferring in? There's a lot to be said, and in the course of our work, we came across a lot of knowledgeable people who said, a lot of the black kids who struggle here, who flunk out or who end up being discouraged, if they'd gone to community college first and gotten the basic grounding and then transferred in, they'd be a lot better off.
Other arguments, the argument that, in fact, diversity, to use that word that we tend to set up as an idol, diversity is actually hugely useful for other students to be able to have a different environment and so forth. Is that sacrificing some students for the? What do you do with that argument, which is in many ways the prevalent argument of lots of college presidents? This is what we need to have to become a better institution.
And one reason that's become the prevalent argument is that the Supreme Court, for reasons of its own, has made that the only argument that they will accept. Past discrimination, they won't accept that. I think they're right not to accept that. I don't think you should have a preference for somebody who's never been a victim of discrimination because his father or grandfather was. But this diversity argument is the one that's carried the day. And I think there's something to it in the sense that if you could have a great racial mix, let's say a proportionate racial mix at all the colleges, and it just happened, the way it's happened with Asians, say, because they're very strong academically, actually they're being systematically discriminated against because they're deemed to be too strong academically. It's like, and therefore, all of the colleges are trying to keep a lid on their Asian enrollment that would go up and up if they admitted on a colorblind basis.
Like Jewish enrollment in the 1920s and the 1930s?
Exactly. It's exactly the same, except for all the people who now deplore that, many of them are indifferent to the fact that we're doing exactly the same thing now. Now, I lost a little track of your question while I was, the diversity thing.
Yeah.
The problem with the diversity argument is, most passionate defenders of affirmative action, the smartest ones, they don't really buy it. They say, yeah, that's fine, but what we really need is to elevate people of color into our leadership positions. And so that's the heart of it. And there's some of that in Justice O'Connor's latest opinion. But there have been academic studies, and I emphasize that there's a lot of empirical evidence in this book. That I'm not just, my co-author is a statistician, so we're talking about, these aren't just our intuitions. This is established by evidence that when students or groups of students, when you have basically a two-tiered, color-coded educational hierarchy in every college in the country because of this system, you don't get the same amount of racial friendships, racial mixing, racial interactions as you would if it happened more naturally. You would get, because they're going to different classes. There aren't, by the end of the freshman year, there are hardly any black kids in the science classes. There are twice as many black women graduating from college as black men, by the way. And this is a zero-sum game. If racial preferences were banned tomorrow and everybody complied, there would not be one iota less diversity in American universities collectively than there is now. There would be some redistribution, less diversity at Harvard and the other top 20, 30, 40, whatever, more diversity at the ones farther down, with all of the black students doing better at every level. And so I think the argument for diversity on closer examination becomes an argument that you're going to have more blacks leading into leadership positions if we have more of them at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, et cetera. And I think that argument, that there are problems with that, but that's what I think it comes down to.
Getting jobs at elite law firms that otherwise they would not be getting? Is it?
They will get jobs at elite law firms, and my co-author Rick Sanders done groundbreaking work on this. Yeah, the elite law firms all have affirmative action. They will hire black students at, with C averages at, say, Harvard Law School when they wouldn't hire a white student unless he had an A average. Guess what happens to those people when they get to the elite law firms? The same partners who at the partnership meeting said, we got to have more black faces here, the clients are demanding it, the press is demanding it, so bring them in one way or another. Well, after they see the first memo by this kid, and it's not competent in the way that they expect their new associates' memos to be, I don't want them working on my case. And so you end up with, with a lot of careers ending unhappily fairly early at these big law firms. And with embittered, throughout this, you end up with a lot of understandably embittered black people. They have been told you're going to do fine at this college. They've been told you're going to do fine at this law school. They've been told you're going to do fine at this law school. All of what they were told was misleading. But they have nobody's ever told them, hey, you're not really well prepared for this. You'd be better off somewhere else. And so a lot of people end up thinking there's something racist going on here that's happening to me. It's hard to pinpoint it. Maybe the professors. Well, I'll tell you a story that a law professor told me. He was teaching at a top 10 law school, not far from here. And at the end of the first year, one of the big exams, two women who had done very badly, black women, came to him and said, why did we do so badly? Now, the exams were blind graded, so you don't know whose exam you're graded. And one of them actually said, could you tell from our handwriting that we were black? Is that why we did so badly? And he said, these women were in agony. They were being tortured, and he couldn't tell them the honest answer, which is, if you'd gone to the University of a different law school, you'd be doing fine. The reason you're not doing well here is that all of your classmates were admitted with much better preparation. Can't say that. And so the system, really, everyone's a captive of the system. If I were president of an elite university that had this system, there would be no way I could stop doing affirmative action, doing racial preferences. Because if I did, I would stick out like a sore thumb. I wouldn't just lose some of my black students. I'd lose almost all of my black students, because all of them would be offered admission by colleges as prestigious or more prestigious than mine. The ones that make admission here would have better opportunities in terms of prestige. People tend to go to the most prestigious places. And so really the only way this is likely to change is if the Supreme Court changes it.
You've been emphasizing preparation. So, and you're not making a bell curve type argument here. You're making the argument that it's poor preparation that largely leads us to the situation. And I mean, I've seen at KIPP Academy, for example, and others that with good preparation, people can be ready to do this. But we'll get into the Supreme Court in a minute, but is your overall solution to take the resources that have been applied to set up affirmative action programs and vice president of diversity and so forth, and apply that to elementary schools and middle schools and really help the preparation? What's our societal solution?
Yeah, and our Chapter 17 addresses this, but in a nutshell, we do not think that there's any genetic component to this. There are respected people who have said that. You mentioned the well curve. Those are respected scholars. They thought there was. My co-author is quite an expert on this, and he says the evidence is quite strong from Harvard economist Roland Fryer and studies by others. This is not genetic. At the same time, I have to admit that saying poor preparation is a little bit of a euphemism because it suggests that the reason is that the schools screwed these kids. The reason that, by and large, middle-class black kids going to the same high school as middle-class white kids do much worse on average. That's not the school's fault, really. And the best scholarship I've seen says, you know, in the old days, you could say blacks weren't having a fair chance at decent education. Often that's not the case anymore. It certainly is in some inner city schools. The problem is racial differences show up by age 2 in learning. They're pronounced by age 5. They grow throughout school. Why do they happen if it's not genetic? We think the best evidence is parenting practices and peer group influences. The latter, stigma against acting white, studying, and parenting practices, and this is not just a poor people phenomenon. The average black, one of the studies shows the average black family of college graduate parents have fewer children's books in the home than the average black high school parents. And children's books in the home is kind of a good proxy for time spent reading to your kid as opposed to parking the kid in front of the television. That's a big problem. So the schools have a big burden to overcome. KIPP Academies, my wife works at DC Prep, which has done even better than the local KIPP Academy as a volunteer in the library, have done miraculous things and with black students, but it's because they're very exceptional places. I think what needs to be done is they need to serve as an example for the public schools, and frankly, the unions are a big part of the problem here. Good teachers, the studies show, are the key ingredient of good schools. Not small class sizes, not the amount of money spent. The amount of money spent on mostly black schools and mostly white schools is not so different anymore. And it's a lot more than it used to be. Per student, school spending has soared over the last 30, 40 years. It's not going to soar much more. We're in a pretty stringent time. So I don't think more resources is the answer. I think better deployment of the resources we have, in particular better teachers, is the answer. And yes, you're right, an awful lot is being wasted on the diversity bureaucracies at the universities and at the K-12 schools.
Tell us about the case the Supreme Court is deciding right now.
It's called Abigail Noel Fisher versus University of Texas. It's their first college admissions affirmative action case since 2003 University of Michigan cases, and the only one before that was the 1978 Bakke case. In the past cases, the Supreme Court has basically said it's kind of done a mixed bag. Well, any racial distinction is especially dangerous, therefore it needs very close scrutiny. Therefore, quotas are banned. Point systems are banned. The University of Michigan undergraduate school, they struck down a point system which basically said, when we compare black and Hispanic and white students, one way that you could do it is we'll just subtract a full grade point average, full grade point from the average of every white or Asian student for purposes of the comparison. That's what their point system came down to. So many points for being black, so many points for having an extra grade point, same number of points for a full grade point. But they upheld it both at University of Michigan Law School, a so-called holistic system, where they hid the ball. They have their quota or their target. They might vary a little bit from it from year to year. They know they want X percent of black students, and they're going to work hard to get it, and they're going to relax their standards to get it. And the Supreme Court indulged the fiction that you can do that while still admitting highly qualified students, that it's just a little finger on the scales, that it's not, when it's a huge weight on the scales. And so the Fisher case presents what I see as a hope that the Supreme Court will not ban this. I don't think you got 5 votes to ban it, but will put much tighter restrictions on the use of racial preferences and on the harms they do to the students who are supposedly benefiting. And the main reason you see that is, by the way, the case was brought by a white girl named Abby Fisher, who didn't get in the University of Texas, thought she would have, but for the racial thing, ended up at Louisiana State. I mentioned that earlier. So her claim is about the unfairness to her. But I'm hoping that as evidence mounts about the effects on the supposed beneficiaries of these practices, Justice Kennedy in particular, there are really 4 justices who will uphold just about any racial preferences program and 4 who will strike down just about any. And Justice Kennedy is the one who seems up for grabs. And I'm hoping that he will put tight limits, and we have some specific suggestions on this, on what colleges can do in considering race.
So if Justice Kennedy takes that middle path, in a sense, rather than abolition of racial preferences, is that really going to do it? I mean, the Supreme Court has already issued, what, 3 decisions? Each time this was supposed to lower racial preferences in admissions, but hasn't really happened, right?
No, and good point. And a lot of my conservative friends who have been long-time eloquent critics of affirmative action loved the first 17 chapters of this book and hated chapter 18, where we stopped short of joining them and saying, outlaw it. And, but, I would say, I'm happy for you to buy the book and like the first 17 chapters and hate the last chapter. But, yeah, we're outliers in that regard. Frankly, one reason I'm glad we aren't saying ban it is that when you say ban it, a certain part of your intended audience just shuts you out. The reason we don't say ban it, and the reason we're hopeful that you could put meaningful restrictions on it, is that we do say the following. By the way, one reason we don't say ban it is we don't think bans have worked very well where they've been tried, which I could talk about. But we have 2 principal proposals for the Supreme Court to impose. One is total transparency. If you want to consider race in admissions, you can do that, but you have to make completely public what your system is. How big a gap is there in the SAT scores of your white and black freshmen? How big a gap is there between the grade point averages of various categories of fraction? How do people do in college? What about your statistics on science retention? What about graduation rates? Because whenever those statistics are available, and the universities try very hard to suppress them, they are shocking. And most people don't know about them because the media aren't interested in them, or at least don't want you to know about them. So that's
the media
one
presentation is that the differences are small, but actually they're huge.
Exactly. And also the media ignore the academic performance, the problems that the supposed beneficiaries have in college. By and large, they ignore it. And so we think, A, as a simple consumer protection measure, the supposed beneficiaries of affirmative action ought to know what they're getting into while people are telling them, oh, you'll do fine. They ought to see how the last kids who did. And partly because we think it would have a healthy effect on politics, on public policy, on what judges do about this. If it's out in the open, it's much harder to say, yeah, that's okay, than if it's all kind of hidden as it is now. And the second, which we think would put a meaningful, I think the real problem with racial preferences in terms of its harm to blacks is the size. If you gave a 1/10 of a grade point average bump to every black applicant over every white applicant, well, you'd be taking kids who are pretty close, and it might be unfair, but it wouldn't be, a huge burden on the black kid who got in to perform. It's the large gap that matters. So how could the Supreme Court make the gap smaller? It would not be a Supreme Court-like thing to do to say, well, you can't have a gap any larger than half a point of grade point or this or that. It would be completely unadministrable and wouldn't sound like constitutional law. We suggest your racial preferences can be no larger than the preferences you give regardless of race based on socioeconomic inequality, i.e., what every college in the country will do now, which is accept the moderately qualified child of a black doctor over the well-qualified child of a white cab driver, they will take the black doctor's kid every time. This would be illegal. And it'd be a little complicated to administer, but we also think another useful thing is is socioeconomic, the domination of the top colleges by people from the top income groups is getting no better over time. And at a time when income inequality, whatever you think of the debate, is becoming a bigger and bigger concern of especially all the people who are advocates of racial preferences are making us more unequal income-wise, not less so. One of the myths is, oh, it's helping with inequality. No, it's not. How does it help with inequality to take the child of a black doctor who immigrated from Great Britain and elevate him ahead of the child of a white or Asian cab driver who's been here for generations? But that's how it works, and the media don't want you to know it.
Questions?
I must have answered them all.
Well, while you're thinking about it, let me just raise one historical point. You mentioned that in a previous Supreme Court debate, when the question was, well, how long will racial preferences continue, Thurgood Marshall broke in to say it would be another 100 years.
He said that.
Yeah. And this remark left Lewis Powell speechless.
Yes, that was reported by Powell's biographer, I think, among others, John Jeffries, a fine professor at University of Virginia Law School. And it was a conversation that was had at 1978 during the conference on the Bakke case, which was the first big affirmative action case of any kind in the Supreme Court. And I think the context was Justice Stevens said, well, after a few, or Justice Black, and somebody said, well, after a few years, that this will be taken care of, the gaps will shrink. And Marshall stepped in at that point and said, another 100 years, 2078. Frankly, looking at what's happened since then, that was optimistic in the sense that what he meant was it'll be another 100 years before the different racial groups are on an equal enough footing coming out of high school so that they can get into, so that you won't need to consider race to get proportionate numbers into college. And that did horrify Powell, although, and then in the Michigan case I mentioned, 2003, Justice O'Connor, who was the key vote for upholding the racial preference program, said, well, we expect this will no longer be necessary in 25 years. That was 9 years ago, 10 years ago. But the gaps at the high school level, coming out of high school level, have not narrowed at all since then. They haven't narrowed since 1990. They were narrowing during the 70s and 80s up to a point, and then they just stopped narrowing. In other words, the blacks stopped gaining on the whites in terms of academic qualifications coming out of high school. There's a whole interesting book to be written on why that has happened, but I think one of the reasons it has happened, I couldn't prove this. There are some things I can prove and some things I just, that seem to me rational inferences. I think affirmative action, racial preferences are one of the reasons for this because of the disincentive effect that I mentioned earlier, and because also they let people who think of themselves as champions of racial equality pretend that the way to solve it is these racial preferences in universities, because guess what? The same people are part of the same political party that is dominated to a significant extent by the teachers' unions. So if you agree with my view that the teachers' unions are a major obstacle to improving K-12 education, why, it's so much easier to channel your political energy and your ideological fervor into we've got to save racial preferences in college admissions than to get serious about improving K-12 education. They've gotten serious about spending more money on it. That hasn't done much good.
And there really, in this sense, does seem to be a parallel with the whole welfare system. That is, anything that tells people who need to work very, very hard that you don't have to work so hard is actually very destructive to them and is going to make things worse rather than better.
Yeah, so, I think that's right. And it has that effect on the students, but I also think it has an effect in terms of diverting political energy from doing what needs to be done about K-12 schools.
Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Taylor.
Yeah.
the Supreme Court recently announced that it was going to be hearing a couple of cases in the near future that are going to be challenging the traditional definition of marriage as between a man and a woman. Are you familiar with that? And what's your prognosis?
I am. I have an idiosyncratic view about that. I expect my fundamental view will not be welcome here, but I think gay marriage is a good thing. Same-sex marriage, call it what you will. I have a very close friend, a fellow columnist of mine from the National Journal, Jonathan Rauch, who's married his gay partner. My niece has married her gay partner, and they've had a child with a donor. And these are, these are admirable people who are, I think, going to stay together for life and kind of serve traditional middle-class values. And as Jonathan has written in his book, Gay Marriage, if you want gays to be part of the mainstream culture rather than part of a counterculture that seems to think that sexual promiscuity is the essence of his identity, marriage is good for that, not bad. Also, I think the institution of marriage has been falling apart for a lot of alarming reasons for quite a while. I don't think gay marriage is really part of the problem. I think it's part of the solution. However, as to the Supreme Court case, I have grave doubt that the Supreme Court should decree gay marriage as a constitutional right. You can write an argument for it. It's not that far-fetched compared to some of the other things they've done on abortion, for example. But, I think there's just nothing in the Constitution that speaks to this. As somebody who favors gay marriage, it's moving along pretty fast on the electoral level, on the public opinion level. I don't think it's likely to be a heavy issue for very long. And therefore, I think the Supreme Court should find a way not to say gay marriage is a constitutional right. I think it's sort of absurd to say that. And interestingly, my friend Jonathan Rauch, who wrote the book Gay Marriage, I just mentioned him, he agrees. I come to that view largely from the standpoint of, as somebody interested in the Supreme Court thinking this isn't what they ought to be doing. Jonathan comes to it from the standpoint of a gay person who wants people like him and their marriages to be generally accepted by the public. He thinks that's more likely to happen if it's not rammed down the public's throats by the Supreme Court. And so he opposes, he thinks the Supreme Court should not uphold the right to gay marriage.
There are some folks who are in favor of legal abortion who feel that Roe v. Wade was a mistake for similar reasons to that.
Exactly. My constitutional law professor at Harvard Law School, John Hart Ely, who was widely regarded as one of the standouts of his generation, now dead, unfortunately, he wrote a book called The Wages of Crying Wolf, not a book, an article after Roe versus Wade that says, I'm for abortion, but this is made-up constitutional law, and the Supreme Court is just going to discredit itself if it rules on issues in ways that are naked politics and have nothing to do with the judicial role. I agreed with that. By the way, one thing, of course, the Defense of Marriage Act is is one of the issues now before the court, and I feel a little differently about whether they should strike that down. I tend to think maybe they should, that it operates in a different way. It basically says the federal government should treat any marriage that's legal in the state, such as Massachusetts, where it happened, you should get the same benefits, Social Security, disability, or whatever. I confess to a personal stake in this. The niche I mentioned, her gay partner, now married, now with a child, is from Mexico. And she's here on a student visa, and the student visa runs out. And they live in New York, and if the Supreme Court upholds the Defense of Marriage Act, they will probably have to move to Mexico because she can't stay unless she gets to stay as a gay married person. And I do have a stake in my niece not being forced to move to Mexico. She's now a lawyer in New York City.
Well, first, kind of on a side note about the gay marriage thing, I disagree with you, but actually I respect you for being able to speak your views of here on the subject here of all places. So thank you for that. Jumping back to the whole affirmative action / racial preferences thing, You mentioned that colleges and universities understandably would want to keep a cap on the statistics and so on about like the point systems and so on. So I'm just out of curiosity, how did you and your co-writer go about conducting your research, like on all the statistics and so on in your book?
Yeah, he's done a great deal of research on law schools. He got a hold to, and that's where he started. He got a hold of a bunch of databases. There was something called the Bar Passage Study that was, a massive database on bar passage rates in the 90s that was assembled because of everybody, people knew that there were huge disparities in flunk rates, and there was a suspicion that it reflected some racial discrimination in the exam. The study sort of pretty well squelched the idea, although very quietly, squelched the idea that the bar exams were racially biased, but they also highlighted, and that was very quiet, how huge the disparities were. The most shocking one was, although most black law students entering law school have lower qualifications than most white law students, you can statistically take groups that are comparable in those regards. Same LSAT scores, same colleges, same majors, same great GPAs. Then they go to law school, and the blacks flunk the bar exam at about twice the white rate anyway. And there's no plausible reason that's ever been given for that happening, I think, because the racial differences should have sorted themselves out by the time you enter law school, except that the blacks are going to law schools where they're being programmed to fail. But there's a lot of other data available that never got any attention. A study done by a Harvard professor named Rogers Elliott in 1996 was the first major study with a large database that showed huge dropout rates of blacks from science. A study in 2003, a book commissioned by the Ivy League presidents, who then deep-sixed it when they didn't like the outcome, by two sociologists, Cole and Barber, had a staggering large database that provided, that basically, the title was Increasing Faculty Diversity. The purpose of the book was, why are we having so much trouble increasing diversity on faculties? The book, much to the displeasure of the people who commissioned it, says, well, affirmative action is a big part of that problem, because the black kids who want to become professors show up at schools for which they're not well qualified, and do badly and become discouraged and do not become professors, whereas if they were going to colleges for which they were well qualified, and there were data to show this, much larger proportion. There have been a kind of an outpouring by academic standards, particularly a taboo subject, in the last 5 or 10 years on the science front, the bar front, the professor front, studies showing that because of unequal academic credentials that there's a lot of self-segregation in the schools. A lot of evidence has come to light, and our book is the first that sort of pulls it together. We didn't. My co-author originated most of the law school research, but there's a lot of other research too. And I should mention that Thomas Sowell and Clyde Summers, who's the law professor I'm thinking of, this is sort of intuitive, and therefore some people figured it out right from the beginning, but they got little attention, and so we hope that putting data behind it gets it more attention. And when I say intuitive, one thing we have in the book is to try and speak to readers who may have trouble figuring this, getting this. Imagine you're a junior in high school in calculus, and you and your best friend are put into an advanced placement course where everyone else in the class is a math genius or close. You're a pretty good math student. The first unit of calculus, you need a month to learn. The rest of the class can get it in 2 weeks and will be impatient to move on. 20 other kids, you and your friend. The teacher's going to move at a pace that serves the median student. You're going to be lost after 2 weeks, after 1 week, maybe after 1 day. Now imagine that everyone else in the class is white and Asian, and you and your fellow student are black, and you begin to get a little bit of an idea what it feels like being on the supposed beneficiary end of this situation.
We have time for one more question.
I just wanted to ask about the timing of your book. Does the Supreme Court do clerks read this? Is this how Supreme Court decisions get made? I mean, are they influenced by things like your book?
Regrettably, maybe not, but it's a good question, and we started this book before the Fisher case was on our radar screen. We didn't have it in mind that the Supreme Court would be dealing with this soon. And to a large extent, our audience is not the Supreme Court, but we want the academics to face up to the harm they're doing and maybe do something about it. Then the case came along, and it became clear that, that it was going to be, that our book was closely related to it. There isn't that much about the case in the book, but it's on the same general subject. And it also became clear that as a matter of marketing, if not, we wanted the Supreme Court to see our work, and also as a matter of marketing, it would have been a catastrophe to have it come out, say, during the long period between the Supreme Court argument and the decision, which may come in June. The argument was October 10th. The book came out October 9th. This was not a coincidence. It involved about a lot of 100-hour weeks during the preceding months to get it out faster. So what do we hope will be the influence on the Supreme Court? Because we knew the book was going to be coming out pretty late anyway, we decided to file an amicus brief on behalf of ourselves in the case, and we filed that in May, making the same basic arguments as the book, less loquaciously. We don't think the court will or should say, hey, Taylor and Sander have figured this out, therefore we're going to do something about affirmative action, because the case hasn't been litigated on that basis. Some people filed briefs attacking us on the other side. It's up for grabs. It's not, the evidence hasn't been vetted to the point that a Supreme Court justice could justifiably say, I'm hanging my opinion from this proposition, even if they could otherwise. But we do hope that what it will do in the minds of some of them, especially Justice Kennedy, who's the one who's kind of most up for grabs, is the traditional presumption, well, of course this is good for the black and Hispanic kids, and Native American, I don't mention much because there aren't very many of them, but they're the other major supposed beneficiary class. The traditional presumption is, of course, it's good for them. The question is whether the benefit to them and the benefit of diversity to everybody else outweighs the harm to the Abigail Fishers of the world who don't get into the colleges they want to. We're hoping that presumption will no longer be, the first thing in Justice Kennedy's mind when he thinks about this case. And if he finds room in his heart to cite us at a footnote or something, why, I'll buy him a bottle of champagne and ship it to him anonymously.
And nevertheless, the Basic Books publicist would love to have a photo of Kennedy walking along carrying the book under his arm. And if this doesn't exist, Photoshop it.
I should mention, I keep saying my book. I had wonderful co-authors for both books, Casey Johnson for the Duke book, Rick Sander for this book, and the books are every bit as much theirs, for better or for worse, as they are mine.
We want to remind you that tomorrow, Rosario Butterfield will be here about the same time in the afternoon. If you would please thank Dr. Olaski, if you'd please thank Stuart Taylor, and we want to thank you for coming out this afternoon. Give him a round of applause. Thank you.